it puts into question, and this is just one example, it puts into question, doesn't it, what compels Western media outlets, for example, to actually come out and feed these lies to the general public?
Well, yes. I think what we're facing here is a powerful axis of pro-Zionist interest around the world, which operates in various different ways to silence the truth. In the United States, generally, it's money that's used to swamp the truth. We're under a torrent of propaganda. In many European countries, the criminal law or government regulations are used to silence the truth. Here in London, Press TV itself has been the victim of attempts by government regulation to try to silence Press TV, for example. And in other parts of the world, more brutal methods are used to silence the truth. The methods vary, the objective is the same: silencing the truth. And here you've seen the most tragic example of these brutal methods being used with this appalling assassination. And of course with Syria being a country that has over the years already suffered so much from imperialist interventions, either open or more often disguised, through many various front groups, through groups funded by Western intelligence services, or behind those Western intelligence services, pro-Zionist forces. The most interesting thing in Damascus over the last 2 months, though, has been that despite all of these intensive efforts, the attempt to overthrow the Syrian government by force, and let's be clear, that's what it was. Washington and London and their allies have shown themselves not to be interested in any form of negotiations, not to be interested in initiatives for peace, initiatives for peaceful resolution of political difficulties in Damascus. It's a clear attempt to overthrow the government there, but it appears now that attempt is failing. What we've seen in the last few days, the ratcheting up of terror tactics, are the tactics of desperation, the tactics of people who certainly aren't about to take political power when they're reduced to the desperation of shooting a journalist on the streets of their own country. These are desperate tactics by forces that, whatever might have seemed the case 2 months ago, are clearly not now about to win control of the Syrian situation, are not about to overthrow the government in Damascus.
Well, you talk about desperate tactics, but how desperate, Paul Wolf, have they gotten? I mean, we're looking at this incident where the press TV journalist died. It was from sniper fire. And it's no news that, I'm sure you're aware also, that snipers of different nationalities are in Syria, like reports of former Libyan snipers, as an example, who helped oust Muammar Gaddafi. Even Afghan fighters were recently cited. So is that how desperate countries that are involved in Syria, Western countries, some of them, and some Arab countries are? And in essence, who's paying for them? Which countries, do you know, are paying for them?
Well, thanks, Kaveh. I think clearly this murder was premeditated. Just look at how sophisticated this was. This murder was timed to occur right after a terrorist attack, and it clearly was a terrorist attack. Your other guest expressed some question as to why would you want to kill innocent people in front of a military base when you obviously can't take the military base. Well, that's a terrorist attack. The purpose of it is to make a big splash in the news media and make it look like the Syrian military headquarters was actually attacked itself. So the person who committed this crime did this right after a huge terrorist attack and knew that they could get away. Now, I don't know where the person was, presumably on top of a building. That person could enter a building in a public square in the capital of the city of Damascus and know that they could get away with a gun and with the whole security establishment of Syria trying to recover from this terrorist attack. So it's a very bold plan. The person did escape. So clearly this was an assassination. And I would go a little further, that person may have known that Press TV was covering that attack. So for people to say, well, Western intelligence services, normally I would write off that kind of a comment as a conspiracy theory. But this was very sophisticated attack. And those people who killed him may have known that Press TV was going to cover it, and may have been watching or even tracking by their cell phones the Press TV journalists. So I think that's very, very significant, that he was not just another journalist who died in some crossfire. He was assassinated. Now, your other question, Kabe, is to why is the press acting the way that they do, and why is Press TV the one who actually has a person on the scene trying to do real news reporting when it's so dangerous? You look at how Western reporters cover these wars, namely Afghanistan and Iraq. They stay in a hotel which is very well protected, usually by the United States military. When they go out, they're embedded with the military. They're very well protected. This man was so brave to do what he did, and I think that he really was trying to tell the truth and trying to tell it just as a normal journalist was, when normally what we see are journalists who really can't work in these areas. They give a military perspective. They get all their information from the military, and I think this gentleman died as a real hero, and it's a real credit to Press TV that they have people like that.
Oh, and actually, switching gears a little bit, it's ironic, isn't it, that you have a Syrian rebel commander today, the same day that we have this Press TV reported to have been killed. He's accused the West of being complicit in the unprecedented massacres, and I'm quoting him, committed by President Bashar al-Assad's forces by refusing to arm them with anti-aircraft weapons. Now, since we're talking about media here, don't you find that ironic for this so-called Syrian rebel commander to make this kind of statement? I mean, where's the media when it came to the atrocities committed by the so-called, for example, Free Syrian Army and the other fighters that are fighting alongside of them, when they're throwing Syrian soldiers off rooftops and massacring them execution style? Why doesn't that get highlighted more in the media? It's touched on and then smoothed out and, of course, never mentioned again, hardly.
Yes, it's absolutely ridiculous, and I think this has been going on for a while now. The conflict has been going on for more than a year and a half, I believe, almost 2 years. There are, there's so much suffering. There are hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced. There are thousands of people who were slaughtered. There's a suffering on a large scale in Syria, and all what the Western media is interested in is to show that there are, people. Or to claim that there are people fighting for taking over of Syria because they want to get rid of a dictatorship. Well, if you want to do a regime change, let's put everything out on the table. If you want to do a regime change, do you destroy the whole country? Do you burn down schools? 2,600 schools have been destroyed in this conflict. I mean, journalists have been assassinated here and there. The latest was Mr. Maya today. There were many hospitals, destroyed, targeted by these terrorist groups, or burned down during the clashes and during the pursuit of these terrorists in order to arrest them and take them to justice. I think, it's time now. It's time to actually sit down, have a ceasefire, sit down on the table and find a solution, a political solution. There is no military solution in Syria.
Well,
soon the winter is coming, and we have hundreds of thousands of refugees out there.
That's the problem.
And I think it's going to be very difficult. The suffering is going to increase, and I think there is an urgent situation here that people must address.
Right.
The whole world must address the situation because the suffering is increasing.
But
I just
Omar Nashabi, when you say a political solution, I'm sorry to jump in, but I have to come in here and say, is that what these countries want, like Qatar? Well, let me turn to Peter Rushton. Let's look at what the Emir of Qatar has said at the UN General Assembly. He said it's better for Arab countries themselves to intervene out of their humanitarian, political and military duties and do what is necessary to stop the bloodshed. I mean, obviously that's another way of saying military intervention. That's what the Emir of Qatar is saying. I'm sure he's in line with Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Perhaps you can shed more light on that. How strong a possibility do you think that is? Mind you that Qatar has never asked for such an intervention to free Palestinian lands, for example.
Well, we know what pro-Washington governments normally mean when they speak of Arab military intervention. They normally mean acting in the interests of Washington. They normally mean funneling cash more than armed forces towards certain groups. Saudi Arabia in particular has acted as the regular funnel for financial aid to groups that serve the Washington agenda, groups that serve ultimately the pro-Zionist agenda. That's been the role of the Saudis, the role of several other countries in this pro-Washington, pro-Zionist axis around the region. Now, I suspect what's more likely to happen now, rather than sending troops, is a continuing effort to send cash, to send weapons to these terrorist groups, so that the situation in Syria becomes a long-running, bloody chaos, rather than a swift takeover of power in the form of an attempted coup. I can't see any possibility at the moment. If we're going to see the possibility of a successful coup for the opposition forces, it would have happened by now. What we're more likely to see is more and more bloodshed over the months to come. And it's a matter really of whether those sincere people who for their own reasons may have backed opposition forces in Syria, whether they can see now that they're being used to weaken the most powerful, one of the most powerful anti-Israeli forces in the region, that they are being used to weaken a government that's prepared to stand up for the people of Lebanon, a government that's prepared to stand up for the people of Palestine, and that the real agenda is not to improve the lives of anyone in Syria, but to create chaos in Syria, to weaken Syria, to weaken a major opponent of Zionism, a major opponent of Washington.
Right.
And it's quite shocking when we see in Washington now the soft words, the pro-democracy words of Obama, when the reality behind those words is the brutal murder of a journalist on the streets of Damascus.
Okay, let's go to the reality of what the U.S. is saying. Paul Wolf, the division is as evident as possible in different statements made. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon, we must stop the violence and the flow of arms to both sides and set in motion a Syrian-led transition. Then you have a U.S. State Department official saying that the United States will soon announce an increase in its aid to the Syrian rebels. Seems like the different important personalities and officials are going against each other. They're not on the same page. In this case, the U.S., as they have said, are going to work outside the UN. Why don't they appear on the same page? What does that reflect?
Yes, I think it's quite ironic, the timing of Hillary Clinton's statements that we're going to be increasing aid to these rebels. Now, she said it's going to be non-lethal aid. But, you know, if this were an ordinary terrorism criminal case, you can't provide non-lethal aid to terrorist groups either. And the rationale is, well, they'll just use it to buy their non-lethal things that they need, and then they can take the other money that they have and use that to buy arms. That's the rationale for providing non-lethal aid to groups that are all involved in violence. So I think the United States is supporting this effort and is trying to do it in a deniable way. But what they have to do is recognize that the rebels cannot win. And the UN, as you mentioned, Ban Ki-moon, he originally, remember, was calling for Assad to resign, which is certainly not within the Charter of the United Nations to recommend who the Syrian people should have as a leader. Now the United Nations is in the right camp. They're saying, look, we have to sit down, we have to negotiate with the rebels, we can't force Assad from power. The United States has not come to that position yet. But the reality is that all of these foreign nations are supporting a rebel insurgency that is too weak to win. It does not have indigenous support. The French want to establish a kind of safe zone for the rebels. But where should it be? There's no part of Syria that wants to be the home for these rebels. When they've gone to Aleppo and some other cities, they didn't blend in with the people who lived there, because most of the rebels are not Syrians. They're people who came from all over the place to fight against Assad's government for their own reasons.
Okay,
so I think it's time for the United States to not fund them anymore.
We're going to have to leave it there. Let me thank our guests. Before I do that, Maya Naser's tweet page is still on. and I quote him on that page, "It's not our job to protect the religion from the grip of the state. It's our job to protect the state from the grips of the religious radicalism of which he became obviously a consequence of." And we dedicate this show to him. Our guest for this edition, historian and political commentator Peter Rushton. We had political analyst Omar Nashbi, human rights and international lawyer Paul Wolf from Washington. Thank you so much for watching, for joining us, and for you, the viewer, for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. From Mika Vatavi and the entire team, it's goodbye.